This is the DRF Players Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the February 28th edition of the DRF Players Podcast, show 217, I believe. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatel, back with you with a very interesting hour of programming today. Not joined by the usual crew. Mike Hogan, our stalwart, our content producer, so many things to this show, is on vacation this week. So we decided that there was no mere one individual who could replace Mike Hogan's contributions to the show. So we've decided to reach out to two separate people a little bit later in the show. If things work out the way that I sure hope they will, we'll be hearing from Paul Matties Jr. But our first guest today, the figure maker for TimeformUS, Craig Milkowski. Craig, welcome back to the DRF Players Podcast.
Thanks. Good to be back.
We do have with us the other member of the usual crew, however, calling in from Planet, Texas today. He is Jonathan Kinchin. JK, what's up?
I couldn't miss out on this one. I would be nothing as a horse player if it wasn't for these two guys. So I felt like I should get on here and try to suck some more winners out of these two.
An excellent idea for sure. Obviously, one of the big things we're going to be talking about through the course of the next hour is figure making. So, Craig, I'm going to start off with a question that came in from a listener. We talked about it a little bit the day when Jonathan had to leave early and jump out the window into his helicopter to drink a mimosa. Mike Hogan and I tackled this question. We chatted about it a little bit subsequently on Twitter, but I wanted to get a little bit more out of you on the topic. And the question was how you can make educated guesses as a horse player about when horses are likely to stretch out. And one thought that occurred to me was I was wondering if there was a way to do that with pace figures. Is this a concept that you have tackled at all in your figure making, and what are your thoughts on it?
You know, it is something I've explored many times over the years, but, numerically, visually. And the thing I find is it's a lot easier to identify the horses that aren't going to stretch out very well than it is to figure out the ones that will. You can look at the figures. If you see a horse running pace figures of 120 and a speed figure of 80, you can be pretty sure that kind of horse isn't going to stretch out very well. But a lot of times you have to watch the race as well, because sometimes it's just pace dynamics, and maybe the horse is in a speed duel and they're going to naturally go faster trying to challenge for the lead. And sometimes if they relax routing, you can see that maybe this horse isn't a speed ball that we thought he was from his figures. So it's a tricky thing. I did hear that podcast you guys were talking about, but I think figures can help a little bit, but I think you also have to watch the races and judge it visually for yourself.
JK, I know you have a bunch of stuff to ask Craig. Why don't you just jump in? We'll alternate questions until one of us has a follow-up here.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest things I've wanted to ask Craig as of late is his investigative work, his 20 his 30 for 30 work on the arrogant time. And I just wanted to know in general, like, how often does that happen? If it happens in our biggest race, on our biggest day in the history of racing, at least for purse wise, how often does it happen at Parks in the third and whatever, Albuquerque Downs in the fifth? Like, how often does that happen, and what is something that we could do to try to resolve that issue?
Well, as a figure maker, I mean, I wish I could say I investigate every race that looks fishy, but it's just impossible to do. There's too many, the tracks change, things change. So it's, it may not always be a timing malfunction. I would say it's probably not something that happens as often as people make it out. Maybe I make it out like it happens too much. Races aren't mistimed habitually. I think it just happens here and there. And there's usually a reason for it. It's a little tougher to figure out when Trackers is the official time or what's going on. When something happens at a track that doesn't use Trackers, you can usually see on the replay something that happened. The trip the timer, you'll see the time pop up on the screen before the horse hits the finish line or hits a quarter pole. So it's just a lot of investigating. You got to know the horses you're looking at as well. I mean, it's impossible to know if a time is bad if you don't understand what the horses should have ran and what the horses in previous races have run. I don't think it's something most people need to be concerned about. You can trust times for the most part. Guys that make speed figures are going to catch probably 95% of them. So even if there's a timing error, we're going to build that into our speed figures. I know I do it. I've seen Andy Byer do it. I'm sure other guys do it. I mean, if you blindly make them off a time that's bad, this figure is going to stick out like a sore thumb. So that's where the human intervention part comes in, and you're able to catch a lot of those things.
So you're talking about the process not only of obviously making a variant in your figures and maybe splitting a variant to make numbers make sense, but I assume you're also talking, Craig, about the concept of projecting figures as well. Here's one question I wasn't planning on asking, and it's one that we could also ask of Paul Matties later in the show. When you're doing figures for as many tracks as you guys do, I mean, to me, that's extraordinary. I sort of understood figure making as a pursuit where a player would be looking at, I don't know, 1 or 2 circuits and making figures based on those. And obviously with Byer, he has a team of associates who take a look at different tracks and different circuits. With you and Paul, you're looking at more or less everything yourselves, from what I understand. How does the relationship, there's got to be some sort of computer element involved in that, it seems like, obviously. How does the relationship between man and machine work so that you can find those instances where the human intervention is required?
Well, I mean, it started, I used to do probably like you did when you read it. I did a lot by hand. I did everything in my head and with calculators. But, those days are long gone. I can download all the data every day. I get a feed of all the results. And, basically, I've learned to be a pretty decent computer programmer for what I need to do. And I'm able to program my thoughts of how I do things, basically. So for every track, I get a data feed. I run it through the program I've written, and it generates a worksheet, which all the grunt work's done. I'm not doing any math when I look at the figures. I'm just looking at, this is what these horses ran today, and then I list what they've run in the past, and based on that, I kind of give a projection, which I may or may not use. I kind of have the PPs in front of me when I'm doing it. And, whereas it used to take me an hour to do one track, it might take me, 3 minutes now. It could take 15 minutes. It just depends on the day. Some days are a lot tougher than other with weather changing. And, you'll get tracks now where you have 5 maiden claiming races on dirt and 5 turf races. So, some are harder than others to do. But basically, definitely the computer is a tool which helps me a lot.
Craig, of all the scenarios that are out there in racing, I would guess what your biggest enemy would be, but I wanted to see if it's right. Is weather like the worst enemy for a figure maker, or is there another scenario that kind of keeps you up at night sometimes and wakes you up in cold sweats?
Weather is something you can't control, and it definitely can cause some problems. But believe it or not, wet tracks tend to be pretty consistent for the most part. Wind can cause havoc. The biggest nightmare for me when it comes to as a figure maker doing races where there just was no pace. I mean, it makes it almost impossible to come up with an actual number. I mean, yeah, I can come on and it's say a grade 1 turf race ran where a grade 1 usually is 125, 130. I can say these horses ran 100 because they went a really slow first quarter. But, we try, our turf ratings are a little different, so it's not just final time. But long story short, pace is the one that gives me the biggest headaches. I can handle really fast paces that fall apart, but when the pace is super slow, that can cause some nightmares and some real outliers in the speed figures.
That leads perfectly into 2 questions I was going to ask. So, JK, I'm going to be a hog and ask 2 in a row here. The first one you alluded to, Craig, the idea that there's more than speed built into the ratings for turf horses. That makes me want to ask you about the general relationship between the time form figures that you'll find in the UK, where time is certainly one element, but there are many other elements as well, and the TimeformUS figures. How do you describe the relationship between the two?
Well, the process to make the figures is completely different, as you allude to. The key selling point there is that we're on the same scale, and we worked hard to get it to where a grade 1 here equals a grade 1 overseas, and 100 overseas equals 100 here. So when horses ship over, you have a pretty rough, a rough guide of what you can expect of them here. Now, what you run into a lot of times is horses that come over were bleeders and they get Lasix here, and you have to do some homework in those spots. But the main thing is the scale is the same, so it's easily comparable when horses ship over. And occasionally our horses ship over there or go to Dubai, or we had Tepin go to England, and the figures worked out great that way as well. For days like the Breeders' Cup and some of the Grade 1 races, we get foreign shippers. It's a really good tool to have.
For sure. And that leads me to want to ask about turf racing in general. You talked about the challenges of these slow paces, and horses are coming home. They're coming home in grade 1 time, but they can't, if they go slow enough early, they can't produce a final time that you'd feel good about making a raw rating on. We talked about this a little bit with Mark Attenberg in our webinar that we did, a basic introduction to Timeform, a couple of weeks ago with Mike Hogan and I, which folks, if they're interested, can find at YouTube. It's actually drf.com/YouTube. But the late pace figures, he mentioned, might start being incorporated into the actual PPs. So my question for you is, how do you use late pace to inform the decisions you make about the figures for these, especially these stakes level turf horses?
Well, definitely on turf, it's a bigger deal. We look at the pace of the race and decide what was more important in the race. Was it final time, or was it how fast they finished? I remember one of Flintshire's races this summer, they went the first quarter in like 27 or 28, so on a firm turf course. So final time was out the window right away. So what we do is when the pace is really slow, we kind of slant our figures towards the closing time. And if the pace is on us, the fast, we go more with the finishing time, the final time of the race.
And do you have any update on that idea of having those late pace figures be in the running lines? I feel like that would be a really neat tool for players to be able to make some of their own assessments about who's going to be running best late.
Yeah, that's a little bit above my pay grade. I know that it is. It is on the table to put those in there. And on our TimeformUS blog, there's actually a late pace figure part there, wherein if you go down through some of the questions, I've actually told people how you can figure out the late pace for each individual race. It involves a little bit of math, but not a whole lot. I mean, you can do it in a few seconds. It's
a fairly simple formula. JK, I'm gonna hijack one more question, then I swear you can ask a few in a row. But when you said the thing about above my pay grade, it reminded me, Craig, of something else I wanted to ask you, and it has to do with your military background. And I wanted to ask you if there were any particular skills or lessons from your days in the military that apply to your life as a horse player.
Really the biggest thing was learning how to use computers to maybe not their fullest extent, but much more than the basic user. They've really helped me be able to, as you said earlier, do multiple tracks, do pace, do speed figures, catch errors easier. As far as a horse player itself, that not so much in the military, other maybe be a little more disciplined. I probably converted more people to horse players when I was in the military than anywhere else.
Craig, I'm always curious to see, and this might be a higher level Timeform question, but what are your preferences when you have, you can click on the actual running line. There's a menu that will come up that says preferences. One of the preferences, weight on, weight off, fractions, pace figures, this horse, the leader, blah, 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 blah. I have mine on weight on, pace figures, and I have it always on this horse. How do you go about it, or is there something any tricks that you could suggest for people when they're looking at those preferences?
We're similar. I do weight on. I mean, the weight adjustments are pretty small, but I do think weight can matter. I also have it on pace figures. The only difference we have is I look at the leaders figures. I'm more of a race shape guy. I want to see what, and we do have the red and blue to kind of tell you the shape anyway, but I prefer to see what the leader did. I don't care if a horse 5 lengths back was, 100 or 105. To me, I'm more interested in what the horse up front was doing. and what kind of style the other horse was showing.
And do you have it in accrued splits or incremental?
I have it in accrued, and I think with pace figures, that's the only one that works right now. But we do, that's another thing that's in the works, I believe, as well, to do incremental for pace figures.
And then the last question is, what's the difference between the adjusted and the official? Is it adjusted based on how does that? Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. The adjusted times are, and what a lot of people like to do for some reason is they try to compare the official time to the adjusted time, and that is completely not the purpose of these figures. I get this question quite a bit. The purpose is to be able to compare adjusted times to other adjusted times. And what they do is they look at how fast the horse is really running, regardless of surface, regardless of track, regardless of the run up. All those things are taken into account. And these are actually the numbers that are used to produce the early speed and the late speed ratings, because we want to know how fast the horse is. A 100 pace figure at 6 furlongs is not as fast as a 100 pace figure at 5 furlongs, and vice versa. So what this does is kind of convert it so you can look and see who's really the faster horse, and that's how we project who's going to get the lead in the race.
So you use adjusted then, huh?
Yes, so use the adjusted time to make the figure, to make the early and late speed ratings. Yeah.
No, but do you use adjusted as on your settings when you're doing your preferences when you're looking at the race?
No, I look at the figures personally, and
okay.
When I want to see the adjusted, I just kind of look at the pace projector because they're basically the same thing.
Got it.
Certainly makes sense that the figure maker would prefer the figure view. That's the whole that's the whole idea. Let me ask you this question. I may not phrase it well enough for it to make a whole heck of a lot of sense, Craig, but hopefully you can work with me. I understand that with pace figures, there's different philosophies for how to approach the enterprise, whether or not in some instances the pace figure is just, let's say we're talking about a 6 furlong race and we're talking about a pace figure that's made to 4 furlongs. It would be making the pace figure to 4 furlongs would be as if the race were only run as a 4 furlong race. The buyer, let's say we're using a buyer style figure, it would be as if it was just a very short race. But there's another way to look at pace figures that encompasses looking at the sections of the race in the context of the final time. Am I saying this correctly?
Yeah, I think I kind of understand what you're saying. And the way I do the figures kind of leans toward the latter, where the pace figures are used almost like an in-race bias indicator. We're telling you, was that pace figure fast or slow for this distance and for this surface? And, compare it to final time. That's where our red and blue fractions that indicate hot and slow pace come from. We're looking at the pace as compared to the final time of the race. I know what a 6 furlong race, I know what percentage the opening quarter should take at Aqueduct. And I know what percentage the half mile should take. So if it's a 1:11 final time, I'll know the average quarters maybe 22 and 4, and average half is 45. So you kind of look at that way. Whereas those 22 and 4 and 45 might be completely different when they go 7 furlongs. So we're more in the second school of what you're talking about. Whereas the adjusted fractions would be the first, is where you're just saying this is how fast they are, period. If the race was 4 furlongs, this is how fast they could go. I hope I explained that well. But
no, you did. That was a great explanation. I thought my question was so poorly worded. I'm feeling bad for the listeners, though. There was a great real-world example. Hopefully I'm not going to hit you with one here that you don't remember, but I believe it was a piece you wrote after the Breeders' Cup where Found won the turf. And it was an example of, I think, Shining Copper in that race running a pace figure to the mile that was faster than the final number that Tepin had run to a mile. But you were explaining this exact thing, how that didn't mean that Shining Copper was going to beat Tepin in the race. Do you remember the piece I'm talking about?
Yes, I do, actually. And the reason it came up was because I want to say the pace figure for Shining Copper was 200 plus. I think that's even in the title of the article I did. The half mile was like a 2:15 TimeformUS pace figure. And I guess the best way to explain that is we're comparing it to what they were expected to run for that distance, and that's, how fast the track was that day. If the horse ran a half mile, he's not going to beat good dirt sprinters. What we're trying to do is show the relationship of the pace to the race in that specific race. Whereas you mentioned the first method, which would show in our adjusted times, I think it may even be in the article, where if you pulled up Shining Copper's adjusted times for that race, it was actually still slower than what Tepin had run in the mile winning. Even to the half mile, Tepin had run a faster raw time than what Shining Copper did. But the reason the pace figure was so high was just because it was so ridiculous for that distance that you knew the horse had no chance of hanging on.
That's a great description. JK, you want to hit Craig with a couple others? We've got about 6 or 7 minutes left.
Yeah, one of the things I like to do is if I'm looking at a horse that's trying turf for the first time, I like to open up the breeding rating and go to the siblings and see what the top figure was, that a sibling has run on grass. Is that your figure, and how far back do your figures go?
Yes, that comes from our figures. Our breeding ratings actually are kind of based on figures more so than winning. A lot of times you'll get, this sire's horses win 20% or whatever. We kind of use that along with the speed figures. And it's, as you say, our figures go back, I believe, all the way to 2005, which if you have a subscription to our past performances, you can open up the charts, and you can explore as far back as you want to go and see any of those. But yeah, I do the same thing. I look at the siblings, but yes, to cut that a little bit short, they are the speed figures that we have, that we gave the horses.
I wanted to ask a general figure question for you, Craig, to help listeners use figures in the right spots. Where do you find speed figures to be the most helpful tool, and conversely, in which races do you find them not to be all that helpful?
I find speed figures are pretty good for older horses, and when you're looking at younger, and I say pretty good in that by the time a horse is 5, 6, 4, 5, 6 years old, you know how fast they are. They don't stay there all the time, but you have a pretty good read on their talent. When you're dealing with younger horses, you're really looking at how fast the horses have run so far, but it's only giving you clues into how fast they can run. And, as we see these horses, they're getting faster and faster when they're 2 and 3. And as somebody one of the questions earlier was about challenges of the figure maker. That's a big one too, trying to figure out just how much these horses are improving and building that into your numbers when you're projecting figures. But so to go back to that, that's the biggest thing for me is if you're just looking at speed figures, who's the fastest, you want to look at older horses. I don't really see a lot of difference between surface and distance, but if you try to do that with 2 and 3 year olds, you're probably going to be in the poorhouse pretty quick.
Craig, I've even before the DRF and the Timeform romance began, one of the things that I used to do was I would write the race ratings in on my DRF PPs that I would print out. And I found them to be pretty helpful. And one of my weaknesses as a handicapper, just I guess maybe just because I haven't been doing it as long as some of the other guys, is identifying the class changes and class drops, going from, what's a better race, a non-winners of 2 at, lifetime 15,000 claimer at Gulfstream, or a 15,000 open at, Tampa, and having that race rating has always been really helpful. And I heard you talk a little bit about it last time, but can you kind of dive into how that number comes about, and is it one that you use pretty heavily, or are you more of a guy that can read the conditions and understand what's going on?
That's a really good question, because I'll be the first to tell you, when we first came up with the race rating, it wasn't something that interested me. I wasn't involved in making it, and maybe that was part of my. I was a bit leery to use that. I didn't trust it because I didn't know what went into it. So I kind of ignored it for a while. And over time, I started looking at it. And as you say, I started, I don't want to read all these conditions. There's so many out there now. And I started looking at the race rating, and I'd see horses, run a good figure, and then they move up 10 or 12 points in race rating for today's race. And that's when the horses seem to have trouble replicating those speed figures. And you'll see horses drop, and all of a sudden their speed figures will go up when they take a big class drop. So, as times went on, I'm like you. I've gotten to where I actually use this race rating regularly. It's one of the first things I look at and compare it to where the horse has been and what they're doing. And I find it a really good tool, and it saves me time. I don't care if a horse has won 3 or 4 in the last 728 days or whatever the condition happens to be. I think it's a really good guide to tell you, hey, this horse is facing steeper competition or it's facing less. And that's about as far as I take it.
I'm going to ask this question, giving you the option to pass, depending on your approach to these type of situations. I don't know. We talk on the show about how none of the three of us, Mike, JK, or me, are real Derby list type guys. We don't have the horses we're following from the day after the Breeders' Cup all the way to the first Saturday in May. But I don't know how much you look at this, but do you have any particular horses who you're especially interested in following as we get into the real meat of this Triple Crown prep season?
I'll be honest, I'm a race-by-race guy, especially when it comes to the Derby. I'm not one to try to guess what's going to happen in May and who's going to show up. I'm more worried now. I'll look and say, hey, who's going to the Rebel? And that's what I care about, looking to bet that race and see if I have any edge there. I try not to get too far ahead. I don't make any Derby list. We do put out the speed figures for all the Triple Crown Trail because people seem to be interested in that. And it's a good thing. I think it's pretty clear to me this year's crop looks good. It's deeper than what we saw last year. We've already had some horses run faster than any horse did in any of the Triple Crown races last year. So to me, that's more interesting than trying to figure out who's going to win in May.
Makes a lot of sense. JK, you got one more for Craig before we let him go?
Yeah, it's kind of a good transition. I know what we're going to do next. What was Gervin got a 113 time form? What did the Pletcher horse? I'm going blank on the name. One. I want to say One Pace, but I know that's not it.
One Pace would be a terrible name for a horse, John.
Yeah, I know. What the horse that won the Southwest? What's his name? I'm going blank on him.
One liner.
One liner.
Yeah, one liner. I think yeah, it's off the top of my head, but I should be pretty close. I think he ran a 121. It was a huge number on our figures.
So he's
for this time of year.
Fastest 3-year-old so far for you?
He is. Classic Empire's juvenile was a little bit faster when he was a 2-year-old, but he is the fastest 3-year-old thus far.
And how do the unique Bella figures shape up against these colts?
I think she's running the 117, 118 range, but much like Songbird last year, I think it's pretty obvious there's a lot more in the tank if she needs it. So it doesn't always work out that way, but I wouldn't want to bet against her with the field she's facing these days.
Makes perfect sense. All right, Craig, we're going to let you get to your meeting. I want to thank you very much for coming in today, and hope to have you back on the show real soon.
Okay, I enjoyed it, guys. Thanks for having me.
Cheers. All right, well, JK mentioned the Risen Star. Well, we try to do a little bit of dancing here and get our next guest into position. We are going to play the full race call of the Risen Star for those who haven't heard about it, and then maybe we'll talk about it a little bit with our next guest, should we be able to get him. So here's the call of the Risen Star. John Dooley with the call.
And they're off in the Risen Star Stakes. Cool Arrow, U.S. officer. Here's Local Hero, who's going out toward the lead straight away for Florent Giroux. Untrapped is right there, too. And on the outside, here's Motown, who's up there for Johnny Velasquez. It's Local Hero, who leads around the first turn from Motown, Untrapped. And Cool Arrow, running in fourth position, has the orange cap. Gervin comes up the rail here at the 6.5. They're being led outright by Local Hero. Then on the outside, Horsefly racing mid-pack. 3 clear from Sorry Eric, U.S. officer with the rail. The comp winner, Guess Sweet, settles into the stakes here for Robbie Alvarado. We come back to shareholder value, and the 4-race maiden Arklow has drifted back to 11th. The quarter for Local Hero, 23 and 3 for seconds. Local Hero has come clear from Motown now by a half dozen lengths in the shadow of the half-mile pole. 4 furlongs for Local Hero, 47 seconds flat. Inside 4 furlongs to go. Motown's running second, then On Trap vying for third with Cool Arrow. Gervin is next as they round the far turn. On the outside, Sorry Eric, a break of 3 more to Guest Sweet. U.S. Officer, Shareholder Value, Arklow, and Horsefly has dropped back to last. They come toward the top of the stretch. Local Hero still has a quarter of a mile to see out. 3/4, 1 minute 11. And 4 seconds, they've straightened. It's Local Hero coming down to this final Fairgrounds furlong. Now here comes Gervin's charge for Brian Hernandez Jr. And Gervin has assumed command for Local Hero. Untrapped is running on, and on the outside, Guest Sweet. But past the 16th, it's Gervin in the Risen Star Stakes. Gervin has won it from Untrapped. Then Local Hero, Guest Sweet. Farther back was Motown, Shareholder Value, Sorry Eric Arklow. We trail back to U.S. Officer, Cool Arrow, and Horsefly.
Impressive winner. Now, I think that actually might have worked. I think we might now actually have a new guest on the show returning to the DRF Players Podcast, Paul Matties. Paul, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. How you doing, Pete?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for taking the time to join in today. Why don't we start off with a quick discussion of that race? I'm assuming you've had a chance to take a look at the Risen Star. Paul, is that a correct assumption?
Yeah. Yep.
What did you think of our winner, Gervin?
I liked him going in. That's why I liked in the race. I didn't love him, but I thought, more of a value play based on his odds and the fact that he'd actually run the fastest race. And I liked this turf race, so I didn't think there was any reason why he wouldn't stretch out. So post one's never bad at fairgrounds, going 2 turns. So I thought it was a more than fair price, which you don't see as much nowadays.
How about going forward? Is this a horse you're interested in taking out of it, or was the Risen Star the day you wanted to be on Gervin?
Well, more than likely, the latter is probably true. That this was the day, but it wouldn't shock me if he moved forward. But he's got to go. He's got to move a lot forward, I think, to be a factor in the Triple Crown races.
We're going to be peppering you with questions for the next about half an hour or so, Paul, assuming you've got the time to hang with us. JK, where should we start?
No, I think that, I think one of the questions that we asked Craig is always one that I always want to hear. I like to hear about the not so glamorous part of figure making. And one of the questions we asked him is, what's the thing in figure making that kind of keeps him up at night? What's the thing that really, is it weather? Is it wind? Is it a track changing in the middle of the day? What's the thing that's the biggest nightmare for you when you're trying to get your work done?
The biggest nightmare is wrong times. And when you find a time that's wrong, because I spend, like say you have a time that's maybe an aberration or something that's like out of the ordinary for the rest of the variant of the day. If you don't have something like that, it's pretty seamless. You just go right through and you don't have any distractions. But when those races come up, I'm under the assumption that I want to know the fast races. So when a fast race comes up, I analyze it to death. Can it be fast? Because I know I'm going to be betting those horses out of that race probably.
Yeah.
So I don't want to make a mistake in those races. And then when it turns out that the time is wrong, that really frustrates me because, I probably spent a lot of time on it, and the fact that it shouldn't have been an issue, now I'm thinking about playing these long shot horses that, or maybe not even long shots, just something that's a little out of the ordinary, which you guys both know. That's what you want. You want something that comes out that sticks out. That's not, if it's the same, if it's an easy variant to do, it's easy on your mentally for that day, but it's not going to lead to any big prices that you want to bet down the road. So I guess that would be the biggest thing that upsets me. Biggest pet peeve probably when the time is wrong.
How do you typically evaluate if it is wrong? I know Craig had mentioned, and I'm sure you read the articles that he had done with Arrogant, and I wanted to know how you kind of handled that situation with there obviously being an issue with the timing. Do you pull out the tape and watch it again with a stopwatch, or do you have a video editing software that you use as well when that stuff happens, or How do you evaluate it?
Well, now it's a little bit easier because you do have some of those things. Like in the old days, we didn't have those things. And I'm not one to jump to that because, I found that, I don't want to. I guess I can call him out. Andy Beyer is somebody that likes to not go with the fastest figure. Like if it sticks out, he's more embarrassed about giving a figure that's too fast. So he will just automatically just say, "This can't be right." That was a bad Andy impersonation. he will just project it down, and I think that's not my strategy. I can see where he's coming from, and I understand the argument, but that's not the way I go about it because I want to bet the horses out of the fast races. I have found over time that's what that's your biggest advantage. I mean, like I said, the biggest downfall of that is a lot of times these fast races aren't true. But I've gotten pretty good at picking out if the time is right, yet it's a fast race that you don't want to play the horses. So, it's $1 million question. I wish I could pinpoint them every time, but you just can't always. And I guess that's what's good about horse racing. But if it would be better if we had the information to be 100% right.
I think some of what you're describing, Paul, is the difference between the job of someone like you making figures for the express purpose of betting on them and somebody like Andy or Craig who are making figures that are sort of, instantly become part of the industry of horse racing. It's sort of a different onus when people are using the figures in the context of what they're putting out there for the world, and you who's only expressly looking to make bets. Do you think that accounts for that difference in your approach from what you described that Andy does? And I think Craig also is probably maybe somewhere in between, but probably closer to the Beyer end of that spectrum.
Without a doubt, and I was in that world, so I know where they're coming from. I worked for Andy for 10 years, so, and I remember the first time we went live at the Racing Times. In the old days, real old days, we were on what became BristNet. It was broadband back then.
Sure.
And a lot of people don't remember, but the figures were there first, the Beyer speed figures. And when we went to the Racing Times live, and it was a different feeling about putting in those fast figures because you knew people were going to bet them solely on what you were doing. And that's a lot of pressure that you have to get used to when you're doing figures. So I understand that you don't want to just arbitrarily put something out there that could be wrong or too fast, And the other thing that's about that is that just because, and now we know more about this, but back then, if the horse was the top figure, everybody would say, well, he's got to win. He's the fastest horse, And nowadays, people are more, understand the fact that just because it is the best horse, the fastest horse, or just the fastest horse that day, there may be a reason why he ran the fastest figure that day. So, and they handicap figures more, where in the old days they didn't. And I think that's why the bounce came into play, so prevalent, because the sheep guys had the same issue. They had to come up with a reason why their top figure wouldn't work, and why they didn't win. So the first was, well, he bounced. It was an easy way out of saying every time the top figure didn't win. I think there are bounces in racing, but I just think that becomes an excuse, and that we see it way more. I think they happen way less than what other people will try that are doing figures will tell you. I know I jumped around a little bit on that explanation.
No, that was a great answer, and I'm going to hit you with a bounce follow-up because I think it's such a great area for discussion. You mentioned that the bounce is less prevalent today. I would agree. I know many players and horse trainers even would agree with that. Why do you think that's the case, though?
Well, for the one thing for sure is that the trainers are running so much less. That's the number one thing, which I think is another thing that is done way too much. I think this notion is overblown that the horses are, not as tough and they can't run back. It's different. There's different reasons why these trainers have decided to run, such a less amount of races, and I think that's probably the reason why you see less bounce. But I also think the players are more educated and the trainers are more educated, and I think they realize why a horse will run a top figure, and that there's circumstances involved instead of just saying, well, he just bounced this day. I'm trying to get some examples of recently, but take Arrogant for example. In the Travers, he in the old days he would have run back. He would have run back 2 weeks in what used to be the Woodward in the Belmont, and if he didn't win, everybody would have said he bounced off the Travers. So, it's a different environment where a guy will just say, all right, I'm not running for the Breeders' Cup. So there's less chances of horses bouncing.
I think it's worth mentioning also, Paul, in my opinion, it could be a case of, I don't know if you want to call it life imitating art or whatever, but trainers are so familiar with the concept, and in some instances using the sheets themselves to help spot their horses. So they're thinking of the bounce ahead of time when they're not, when Baffert is questioning before running American Pharaoh in the Travers, and he's saying to himself over and over in his head, I probably would be better off with a couple extra weeks and running in Pennsylvania. Whether he knows it or not, he's thinking like a sheets player, which I think is interesting.
Without a doubt. I mean, Chad Brown is the ultimate sheets better.
Yeah.
He is the quintessential, sheets better. So it's not surprising the way he operates because I know he's a big believer in that, and you could just tell. I mean, he just operates that way. The thing that I think it's hurting racing, though, and I don't want to get into a big philosophical thing about where I'm not sure it's the trainer's job to do that. I think that they've taken it on that it is because they're worried about their percentages and they're worried about other things. But I think the horse racing in general would be in better condition if the trainers didn't have that outlook, and didn't feel embarrassed, like, all right, so Baffert lost it, American Pharaoh lost the Travers. I don't think it's fair to blame it on Bob Baffert. I mean, that's I know he will be, it'll happen again. Somebody else will blame the trainer or something like that. I'm not sure that's a fair argument, and I think that leads to racing being in a worse place.
JK, I know you have a bunch of questions here. Dive in and let's hit Paul with a few more.
Yeah, one of the coolest things that I've gotten to do is sit around you guys and watch you and Duke design races, and it's one of the parts of my game that I want to continue to improve upon.
Describe what you mean by that, JK.
Yeah, and this is actually I picked the word up, design, from them. Designing how a race is going to unfold. This horse is going to break and go to the front. This horse is going to sit off of him. This horse is going to sit right in behind and get a perfect trip. Blah, blah, that type of thing of how the race is going to unfold from a pace perspective and trip perspective. And I think that, you two guys do it better than anyone I've ever seen. One of the things that I wanted to ask was, how do you use pace figures in general to design a race? What are is your thought process when you're looking down at it? What are some of the things that you say or look for when you're trying to design a race?
Well, just back to I'll back up a little bit. Like you used the word situations. I think you're really good at this too, Jonathan. After the fact, particularly, I think more than what form cycles and some of these other things that people use to handicap, and you'll agree with me for sure on this, Jonathan. I think situations are really the key, to horse racing. You have a bunch of evenly matched horses running every single time, and I mean, once in a while you have you have something that's where a horse is 20 lengths is the best, but that's a rarity. And so the thing that changes the result from week to week, or 3 weeks be right nowadays, is the situations that are different. And my father was the one that really started in on that. He would always say that's a situation win, or that the only reason why that horse won is a situation. And I just reversed it. You watch the races and you say, well, that he won for the situation. So what ends up happening is you try to start predicting the situations. And to answer your question is, you just watch races and try to figure out which situations won, and then put that to the empty canvas of the next race, and try to picture the situation that's going to play out this time. And the pace figures will sort out who's going to go forward, who's going to go back. The thing that maybe some horse players don't realize, and I'm probably guilty of this sometimes, and I would say that Duke is too, that that you think that horses are can just be sent crazy all the time, and will make the lead. And what the pace figures do is that it puts you in a realization to say, well, even if the jockey's sent, he can't stalk the slow pace. He's not fast enough, or he can't make the lead, or he can't take him back. If he does, he's going to be ranked. He's just too fast to be, in a situation that you want him to be. And that kind of, I hope that makes sense. But that's the way I go about it. But on the opposite end, the pace figures could say, all right, the way this race is going to play out, 3 horses are going to send, and this horse is fast enough to sit in right behind him. He may have 7ths and 8ths on his form, but the pace figures might tell you he's going to fall into being 4th. Whether he's 4 lengths behind or if he's 2 lengths behind, that'll be up to the jockey. But he's going to fall into the right situation.
I love this idea. This situational handicapping idea is really very strong. I think many people are familiar with a couple of basic concepts: the merry-go-round race, where the horses run 1, 2, 3 in that order around the track; a pace meltdown situation where horses are going to go so fast that it's the horses that are 8th, 9th, and 10th early who are going to be there at the wire. But it sounds to me, Paul, like you take this concept a bit farther and are looking for all kinds of variations of different situations you might see during a race and trying to predict those. Is that accurate to say?
100%, and you nailed it. Everybody knows the 2 examples that you gave. And in fact, I think it's hurt. Some of these racing is because every time I think it hurts the jockeys somewhat, because if they take a chance, everybody says, well, he moved too soon, or and when there's a lot of speed in the race, well, we can't go hard now because we'll set it up for the closers, the meltdown. So those are 2 situations that are just universal and everybody knows. But I would subscribe that there's hundreds, thousands of them out there. And if anybody's listening, to find those are I think the keys to being successful.
Without asking you to give away the store, Paul, there's one leap to mind that might not be as familiar to some of our listeners.
Well, I will say the most important one, even more important than the speed duel one and the meltdown ones, or the lone speed ones. The most important one that I have found in the last 20 years is the fact when 2 horses that are, if they go in a slow pace, and I'm going to use a term that most people don't know, but where they don't downline at all by going to get to the lead. And what I mean downline is that they don't use up any energy at all. If the 2 horses go out and look at each other on the front end, race dynamics and situations, the horse on the outside has a huge advantage. And I don't think that's known as much as how true it is. If you watch slow pace after slow pace, the horse who stalks or tracks, because people don't use a different terminology for stalk, but if the horse who's sitting on the outside of a slow pace, he has a tremendous edge. And I believe that in modern day racing, a lot of people use the leader as the key, the key part of the race, and that, the significant horse in the race, what he has done. I contend nowadays the horse that's stalking the horse on the outside is the key of racing today. And I would say that was something that if your listeners could get a grasp of, I think you'd have an advantage over, because I don't think that's not a universal thought.
No, I think many people would think the inside horse has the advantage there. Is this specific to I assume we're talking about an unbiased racetrack, and are we specifically talking about a slow pace in that scenario?
Yeah, 100% a slow pace, a race where a race that extremely slow pace in my eyes, a race that has where the horses made it to the top of the stretch without any sense of a duel at all. When they're just out there and both jockeys have dropped the reins and they're just looking at each other and they're going to wait and they're going to try to sprint home. Now, the tricky part of racing that maybe would be the next level, after you learn that, is that in modern day racing, races quicken up now at different points. Where in the old days, you kind of had a feel of how the race was going to go. Guys were going to send. There was going to be some breathers. The middle horse would come at you first, and then the closers would come. The race shapes don't play out that way. They're not standard anymore, and especially because these races will quicken at different points. And I think once you start learning that concept, that the race quickens at different points, you'll see these different situations that evolve.
JK, what else you got for Paul?
No, he's talking about something that I think I've been trying to pick up recently, and that's identifying finding middle moves. I think that's one of the things that kind of falls through the cracks the most with pace figures and trackus and ground loss and video replays. A lot of the troubles and traffics and wide trips and steadies and pace duels and slow paces, that stuff shows up. The thing that I think gets lost is the middle move, and it's one of the things that I've tried to improve on identifying, and I know that it's something that's really important to Paul as well.
Yeah, and the other thing about it too is it's probably there is some science behind it, but it's a hard thing to calculate. So it's really a visual, of getting. Now, if we had more data and you could plot these points in the pace a little bit more, I think that advantage would go away, because I think people would pick up on it and it would probably be more visible from what you're saying, Jonathan. But right now, with the way that we time things and the way we chart races and stuff, it becomes more. And the other thing about that is, let me add one more thing about that.
Please.
I think what's sometimes lost about trip handicapping in situations is that horses, it's sometimes when they run. Like you listen to somebody who say, even when you know if there's a bias, okay, and a horse will be wide, for the first part of the race, but it was slow, and then he'll angle inside, and that's when he makes his run, and then the momentum will carry him where he's going to run over the other horses, and he'll go out around them. So, he'll have a trip that doesn't look like he was inside, with the bias, but he actually was, at a huge advantage from the track, even though he may have only been on the inside for just the time when he started to accelerate.
That's a great point about, absolutely. The idea that what matters isn't so much how wide a horse is in aggregate when looking at a race. What matters is, was he running on the best part of the track when he was doing the quote unquote real running of the race? Is that the?
Absolutely. That's you said it better than I did.
Yes, and it's Duke has preached that to me for a while about identifying when the running was done. If a front runner was on the inside and it was a dead rail, and he's doing that running early, it's much more significant than if he's running on the inside late when he's already done and he's already tired.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean,
I think
you
also
see
that.
Yeah.
Oh, you go ahead, Paul.
Well, a lot of times you'll see the horse that will drop to the rail on a dead rail, and and it might even get him beat. You know, like he might lose by a nose, and you say, well, he lost because he dropped to the rail. But if it was wide the whole way, he kind of was with the track the whole way, and you could be really fooled by the fact that, well, he dropped the rail and got beat, but he had a pretty good trip the whole way. That's when bias stuff gets really tricky.
It's a lot to process. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of thoughts you have to keep in your head. Just to tie it back a little bit to the previous conversation when talking about trips, probably worth highlighting that just as it's important to know where a horse was on the track during the real running of the race, I think it's also important, and tell me if you agree, Paul, that you give extra credit to moves into the part of the race where the real running is being done. I mean, that you were essentially saying that before, but it's really, in a way, a pretty similar concept, I think.
Yeah, and then there's situations that evolve, like, okay, so being wide in the turn of a race may not be all that big a deal on a normal racetrack, all right? But say the track is inside, and now let's go to the fact that we ran a 50 half, and we're going to go, they quicken up almost full tilt into the turn, and he's 4 wide. Well, now a trip that goes from being not so bad goes to being terrible, and where you have no shot. I mean, I could show you the math where it would be physically impossible for that horse to win. So, and when you say that to somebody, they say, well, look, if he was the same horse you're telling me was in the same spot, and yet it was 2 completely different situations where one was completely against the track and one might not have been. And, I mean, to me, that's what makes, racing great, because it's not, it's not some cookie cutter thing where you can just put everything into place, but it is frustrating, and it's hard to grasp sometimes without seeing it over and over again.
Well, it's experience is an amazing asset to have, and I love the way you paint it as this multi-layered, multi-variable equation that really can take a lifetime to solve. And even if there's some people out there listening to this and say, and I'm a little intimidated, Paul, when I hear you talk about some of this stuff. I can imagine some of the listeners are too. This is what you're up against as a horse player, people who can think like Paul does. But at the same time, I feel like there's something exciting about the idea that this pursuit that we've all chosen of playing the horses can be a puzzle on this level, and to know that these are places you can go if you think about it and you get the right experience. Would you concur with that, Paul?
Well, definitely. I mean, I think anybody who loves horse racing will continue. I can see where it's a little intimidating and a little confusing, but if you like handicapping, I think you want to get to why. I might have said this to you before, Pete, but even on this show, if I ever write a book on racing, it's going to be why horses win. My life my life has been a search into why horses win. And a lot of times it gets simplified, and it's not the truth. And I'm not saying I know why every horse wins, but if you keep that question in your mind while you're watching races and while you're betting, why did this horse win? Why did he lose last time? Why did the horse beat him last time? Those types of questions, you'll find the real answers. And to me, that's the quest of any handicapper.
And I know we're running low on time, but that's kind of a great lead into my follow-up question. And it's like I said, it's great watching the differences between you and Duke at times, and I think that most people know how Duke handles tough losses. He takes to a message board or Twitter. How do you keep a level head when you miss something or when you get beat? I think for someone who plays every day, at the level that you play at. I think, some of the other guys that are starting to kind of pick up handicapping, or people that have been doing it for a long time, like how do you kind of transition from a bad beat or a bad handicapping job where you missed something, or poor scheduling of time? I know I was with you at Gulfstream where you mapped out a pick 5 that paid 5 digits and didn't bet it. So how do you kind of get over those situations and move forward?
Yeah, that was the situation you're talking about was I was on an airplane and the Wi-Fi went out when I went to bet it. Oh. And when I saw Jonathan after that race, I wasn't happy about it. But I think that losing, to answer your question, the losing is without a doubt the hardest thing in racing, and it never gets easier. And especially when it's, I get more upset when it's me that I've done something wrong than maybe a bad beat. If you do this long enough, you know that you're going to have the bad beats, and you kind of roll with them. I get upset when I've missed something, or like in that situation where I didn't call back, or I didn't find a situation that I wanted to find handicapping. And I think everybody deals with it differently, so it's not something I can say, all right, do this every time. It's like it's almost like, this is what I talk about, and I think Pete's made fun of me on this a little bit, and I think the people have made fun of my father, is that's the part that I think resembles an athletic event, handicapping, is how you handle the adversity. How do you handle when you're down? And not everybody's the same, but I do know that that's the toughest thing. Anybody can win. When you're going good, everything goes good. There's some people who bet too much when they're winning, but for the most part, people get used to that if they've done it for a while. The bad part is losing, and when you're doing things right and you're losing, that's really difficult. And
all right,
I don't have a good answer.
I gotta cut us short, guys. Paul, we're gonna have you back on soon, because we didn't even talk one word about tournaments, but we went in some interesting places. And I want to thank you for all your time and your great thoughts today. And we'll definitely, assuming you'll allow us, we'll have you back on real soon.
Oh yeah, it's great talking to you guys. Yep. We'll see you later. Yep.
All right, that's it for today's show. I want to thank Greg Milkowski. I want to thank Jonathan Kinchin. I want to thank Paul Matties. Most of all, I want to thank all of you for listening. I will be back along with JK and I don't know who else on Friday. My name's Peter Thomas Fornatal. I hope you win all your photos.